Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. With all the COVID lockdowns, we repeatedly hear of the massive downturn of the travel sector. Very few Canadians are traveling, and even few are flying. If you've had to take a flight in the past year, Canadian airports look like ghost towns with very few patrons or staff around. It's all rather eerie. Just last week, I was in the vicinity of the Toronto airport when one of my children remarked, "Look, Mom, an airplane in the sky," as if she hadn't seen one in her entire lifetime. But for her, it probably seems like a lifetime since she had last seen an airplane in the sky. So if fewer planes are flying, what happens to the airports? Who pays for their upkeep and rent if the normally exorbitant airport and gate fees are not being paid by the airlines? Quick answer, is it us, the taxpayer? And just to put some figures out there, in 2020, the estimate of total losses by airports globally is $114 billion. Canadian airports are asking and receiving bailouts to help cope with the losses, but were airports well run to begin with? Is the Canadian model of airport ownership the right one? And what about the potential disastrous shutting off of Pipeline Line 5 by Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer? This line feeds into another which provides 100% of all the jet fuel for the Toronto airport. Whenever the Toronto airport gets up and running again, our sole conduit of jet fuel might be non-existent. So, will Canadian airports go bankrupt? Is that even possible? And how will a potential Line 5 disruption impact Canada's once busiest airport, Toronto Pearson? Well, joining me now to discuss is Cody Battersill, founder of CanadaAction.ca, and Peter Sean Taylor, senior features editor of the C2C Journal. Thank you both so very much for joining me. I hope to have a very interesting, enlightening, and lively discussion on airports. And, you know, previously, before preparing for this show, I hadn't given much thought to airports, to be quite frank. But as I did some research and uncovered, it seems that there's a lot that must and it needs to be discussed here. So perhaps I'll start with you, Peter. How are airports owned and operated? I think for our viewers, they need to kind of contextualize this discussion.
Well, Canada actually has the ownership structure in Canada is unique in the world, and it actually goes back to the 1993 federal election between Kim Campbell and Jean Chrétien. There's not many public policy issues in Canada you can say goes back to the Kim Campbell government, but this is actually one of them. People with long memories might remember that the Campbell government had a proposal to partially privatize Pearson Airport, and that became a big election issue. Jean Chrétien called it immoral, I think, and vowed to shut it down. And so when he won the election, there was to be no privatization of the airport, no private sector participation, and instead what we have is a what's called a non-profit, non-share capital corporations that run them. All the airports, all the major airports in Canada are leased by the federal government. It maintains ultimate ownership over all the airports, and they're all run by these airport authorities that don't have shareholders to answer to. And can, as you all know, levy as many airport user fees as they feel the market can bear. So that's kind of the background of how we got to where we are, and no other country in the world does it that way.
Wow, well, it's interesting that we're unique there. Also, you mentioned the airport fees, and I remember the stat is probably old, but a few years ago, there are no stats now because nobody's charging gate fees, but I remember the Toronto Pearson Airport had some of the highest gate fees in the world, and that's why our tickets to land or fly out of Pearson were always so much more than some of the other smaller airports. And now we see other airlines taking advantage of those smaller airports, well, when we were operational. Okay, so that's very interesting. So in general, though, I guess you can. My follow-up question is how are airports funded? You said through gate fees. There's some subsidies, perhaps.
It's 90% volume fees. Air travelers passing through the airport paying all the various user fees that they get in with, and also the airlines being charged gate fees and whatnot. That ultimately comes back to ticket prices as well. So it's almost entirely just air travel pays for
Right.
the things. And with that down, about an average of 80% across the board since the pandemic, airports in Canada are in serious financial problems.
Welcome back. We're discussing airports and the future of airports in Canada and why they're necessary and what's the best way they should be operated. Joining me is Cody Battersill, founder of CanadaAction.ca, and Peter Sean Taylor, senior features editor of the C2C Journal. We're going to get to you in a moment, Cody, but before we went to break, Peter, we were discussing the current structure, which is unique in the world, of ownership of airports. And I know the debate is always privatized versus making it publicly funded, public or privatized. But isn't there some middle ground? What about some kind of triple P partnership or something of the sort?
Well, sure. Going back to 1993, when Jean Chrétien decided that there would be no private investment in Canadian airports, there was all sorts of a variety of private investment, ranging from Europe to Britain to Australia. Sometimes they're owned outright. Sometimes it's shared with the government. Sometimes the government has the majority share. So certainly there's a whole range of options out there. It's a purely ideological position that we're in Canada, where our government said that we don't want to have private investors anywhere near Canadian airports, and so they created this really unusual structure that is now, the chickens are coming home to roost from that, because they don't have any way to raise money outside of government bailouts.
And when we're thinking about government ownership of an airport, for example, we have, and Cody, you're going to want to jump in here on this, but when we think of some of the potential mishaps that are going to occur in the very near future, we talk about Line 5. Line 5 is that line coming in through Michigan that feeds 100% of the jet fuel to Toronto's Pearson's airport, amongst a few other airports, but 100% of the jet fuel comes through there. So if the government can't even, I'm sorry to say, but manage our relationship with the governor south of the border to get this line continually, to get it flowing so that we can get our jet fuel. My concern is I'm not sure if I want the government managing my airport. Can you explain what's going on with Line 5?
Well, I think there's a couple important points to be made about how pipelines impact all of us and how resources impact our economy. And so with Line 5 specifically, if this pipeline is to be shut down, we could see a cessation of activities at Pearson Airport, barring some sort of alternate arrangement. And I mean, that alternate arrangement would be trucks potentially, and increased fuel costs. So more fees, more expense in flying. There's pre-COVID at the peak, there was a couple 100,000 flights per day around the world. That's all made possible by oil. And we need to be having a more informed conversation about how do we support our economy? How do we allow Canadian families to go on holidays and to do travel? How do we also help the government maximize revenue so they have money to pay for things like airports? And how do we ensure reliable, secure, responsible access to energy that we all rely on, like the Line 5 pipeline, which supplies the jet fuel to Pearson? Imagine you go to Pearson, all the flights are canceled because a pipeline got shut down. Everyone would quickly realize that we all rely on pipelines, even if we don't always realize it.
And the pipeline got shut down by a foreigner, no less, just so that we're all clear. So what do you propose would be a good solution, specifically for Line 5? What do you think should be done there? And in general, advocate for pipelines and why we need to keep going, and how not only do they support many sectors, but airports specifically?
Yeah, and it's interesting because in Vancouver, they did a 13-kilometer jet fuel pipeline project in the last several years here, and it didn't raise, got no news coverage. There was no protests against it. I think we all need to understand that pipelines are the safest way to transport the oil and gas we all rely on. And when we're talking about Line 5, this pipeline has been in operation for about 65 years. The Hoover Dam was built by the same company that built this pipeline. And it has never had an incident in the waterway that the governor of Michigan is concerned about. It supplies home heating, jet fuel, gasoline, all these different products to Quebec, Ontario, the airports, and several states, especially Michigan. So we need to get back to balance when we talk about pipelines, supporting Canadian energy, maximizing the value of our resources, so we can support our families. We are leaders in protecting the environment, and substituting a pipeline for thousands and thousands and thousands of tanker trucks in some of these scenarios is absolutely ludicrous. It increased costs and it doesn't help the environment.
No, and I mean, it sounds asinine. And you're right on all those points. You know, if this line gets shut down, there's discussions that perhaps there will be tankers going across the Great Lakes with barrels of oil. You know, I think we all have known that there have been spills on occasion, not frequently, but it does happen. So is that safer than going through the easement through Michigan? I don't think so. And you're right, with all the increased vehicular traffic transporting, say, the jet fuel to Pearson, if Line 5 gets shut down, that's definitely no friend of the environment. We're going to continue this discussion on the future of airports when we return. Welcome back. We're discussing the future of Canadian airports, especially amid the COVID shutdown. Joining me are Cody Battersill and Peter Sean Taylor. Peter, Canada has such a unique geography. We are very regional in many regards. Our populations are, as far as, you know, from St. John's, Newfoundland to Victoria, BC, and our neighbors, our friends and Canadians in the north. With our climate differences and our topography, Canadians rely on air travel. Now, I know we're reduced right now, but when I hear about airports, you know, potentially shutting down, or they obviously can't sustain this lack of activity, there's no revenue coming in to pay their rent and their fees. This kind of makes me worried about what the future holds for Canadian. I mean, for Canada, are we going to become fractured physically fractured as a nation if we can't get to one another? Again, am I being alarmist here? Peter?
Well, I think there's no question that there's a reckoning coming. I don't think it's a reckoning that's going to involve shutting down the main airports. I think what has to happen is we need to see a revolution in how airports are owned and managed. The airports aren't going anywhere. I think it's to settle your concerns, but governments are going to have to come to terms with the privatization. And we've seen even just during the current Trudeau administration, airport privatization has come up at least twice. Once with the Emerson report, another time Credit Suisse consultants report. So it's always been out there. Up till now, it's been dismissed as something distasteful for Canadians. But we're going to have to get there. And I think there's still a lot of interest in large institutional investors, pension funds and whatnot.
Of course.
They're interested in buying large transportation infrastructure like airports. So the interest will be there, even though we're in a historically grim time for the air travel industry. We just need someone to step up and admit that the status quo is not working. And I think we're going to get there sooner rather than later, because the airports are just bleeding money right now.
And again, when you say bleeding money, I mean, any revenue they take in, they basically pay their landlord, which is our federal government. So is this kind of like robbing Peter to pay Paul? I mean, we're going to have to bail them out, but we're in turn, the government is basically their landlord. So how does that actually work?
Well, I mean, the airports have added another $2.8 billion in debt just in 2021. I realize that billions and trillions sort of lose their meaning in this current era, but you can be certain that if you don't have any revenue, $2.8 billion in new debt is pretty substantial. And that's the thing. If they're borrowing, most of these airports are borrowing on the private market from institutional investors, and they owe the interest when it's due. And if they can't pay because they don't have any revenue, those bond investors, the bondholders, are going to ultimately come to the federal government, because they're the backstop, right, presumably, to all these airports. They're the ultimate owner of the land.
Yes, the buck stops with the taxpayer ultimately.
Yeah.
In your report that you outlined, you suggest that airports have become almost like these cathedrals, that there's almost this competition to build the better and the bigger and the more flashiest, interesting airport. Cody lives in Calgary. There's an example of a recently renovated or added onto airport. Did they do a good job? Was there good accountability with that project? Peter?
Oh, no, I mean, that's the problem. One of the key problems with the current Canadian ownership structure for airports is they don't have to earn a profit, and there's no investors to answer to. So yes, they've all tended to gold plate the airports. And Calgary is a classic example, an enormous, very expensive expansion in recent years. It unfortunately just was finished by the time the oil price started to tank. So that was bad luck on their part. But yeah, Calgary has been overbuilt. In 2005, the head of the International Air Travel Association called the Pearson renovations Versailles with boarding bridges, which is always a memorable phrase. But yeah, it's another unfortunate consequence of how we run our airports, is that these airport authorities might as well build it as big as possible. There's always another user fee we can tack on to get someone to pay for it. But now, without any user fees coming in, the debt is really starting to mount.
Okay, Cody, I want you to chime in on the Calgary airport, but we're going to have to cut to a commercial break. But we will be right back and resume our discussion on airports in just a few minutes. Welcome back. We're concluding our discussion on the future of airports here in Canada. And joining me again is Cody Battersill, founder of CanadaAction.ca, and Peter Sean Taylor, senior features editor of the C2C Journal. Cody, just before we went for break, I want you to chime in because you're from Calgary. Do you feel that the Calgary airport lacked oversight, and as a result, it's far more, ostentatious or grander than it should be?
I really love the airport. I think it's a beautiful example of sort of industrial or institutional architecture. Everyone that I've talked to has really enjoyed it. It does serve to sort of collect and then connect people from a lot of the smaller areas. And, there were some more exciting flights. They started doing some direct flights into Mexico and into China. I think that the air passenger traffic has held up relatively well pre-COVID. And of course, now COVID hit. So I think when we're talking about the airports and the debt, there's also a good analogy that we can make there to what's happening for families and also for the government. And this is, again, why without a pipeline, we're not going to have jet fuel at Vancouver or Pearson or any of these airports. And the alternative isn't better for the environment, but also, when we maximize the value for our resources, we all benefit. Governments benefit. The Canadian oil and gas industry, for example, has generated about $500 billion to our government since the year 2000. And I just think when we talk again about geography, how large our country is, we don't always understand different resources and different communities in other parts of the country, but it's really a good thing for us to try to do more of that, to learn more about other provinces and other resource sectors so that we can reduce the polarization and have a balanced, informed conversation about environmental protection and supporting Canadian families. And that means supporting Canadian resources.
I agree. And in some capacity, one can suggest that these airports are resources because sometimes just visiting a different place. So, if you're in Halifax and you fly out to Calgary, for example, or to Edmonton, and you get to see firsthand, wow, this is a different part of Canada I wouldn't get to see. And it's not exactly reasonable to drive across the country. That's why, when we talk about the future of airports, it does alarm me because I worry that we are going to be with fewer lines traveling. Like, for example, Air Canada, I think, recently announced that they're curtailing their regional routes out east because their volume has dropped by something like 90%. It's huge. But does that mean now that the entire Atlantic Canada, that region, is going to be isolated and cut off from the rest of the country? What happens if this happens in British Columbia or where you are, Cody, in Calgary? How much further will the West feel disconnected from the rest of the country? Do you have any comment on that, Cody?
I think right now the best place we can look is what's happening in the United States, and passenger traffic is coming back with a vengeance, and people are flying. And I think once we get through the vaccine rollout and we get through this kind of third wave of COVID, I think people are going to want to get out. They're going to want to travel. They're going to want to see hopefully other parts of the country. They're going to want to connect again with friends and family and loved ones that they haven't seen for over a year. And airplanes make that possible, our airports make that possible, and jet fuel makes that possible. Oil and gas makes that possible. So I think just trying to, again, find that middle road, and we all need to work together. Line 5 is so important for the economy and for these other aspects of the airport discussion. So.
And Peter, I just want to give you the final comment. We have about 45 seconds left before we have to wrap up the show. But you seem to You seem to be concerned that there were already issues with airport management beforehand. So even if tourism comes roaring back, sure, that might be a spike in fees, et cetera. But there are still management issues that need to be discussed for the long term. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, we've even seen airport user fees go up during the pandemic, simply because they had such little revenue stream that they had to squeeze whatever they had there, and you don't often see user fees go down. So I think the groundwork has been laid for even less efficient and cost-effective airports. So as I said, I think we do need a revolution in ownership. We need to get private sector investment in there. We need to get profit and loss to be an overriding decision when we're running our airports.
Okay, well, thank you very much to the both of you for joining me today. I appreciate it. Some interesting points on airports and air traffic here in Canada. Obviously, with our unique geography and topography, we do need our airports functioning, and we need them functioning well. So even though there may very soon be on the horizon a big roaring back of air travel, we still need our airports to operate properly for the long term. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.